Welcome back, everybody. So today we're on the first turn for the Russians. As we can see at the end of the previous turn, the Russians had at least one squad become prisoners of war. We also had the unit that captured them deploy, as you're allowed to do so automatically. And we're left with a bunch of units that are still under DM, or Desperation Morale status. The first roll of the turn will almost always be for weather. I believe I was... Why did I roll 9? Yeah, it's been too long. That's sort of the problem when I record such long videos. And especially when I do commentary a week and a half after the fact. There's a few things to really take note of. First off is that the player, when it's a player's turn, they are allowed some rallies, some self-rallies. Now, in a normal game, you'd only be allowed one self-rally per turn, per player turn. So, for the Russians, you can only get one self-rally, etc. Now, in a game as big as this, when it comes to the campaigns, the developers realize that you end up having so many men that you would not be able to effectively just rally one. It just wouldn't. Your numbers are so high that they said we'll add a second self-rally possibility for each side. So for both the Russians and Germans, they should have 2 free self-rallies, which aren't counted alongside of units that already have a self-rally ability. But I may be getting ahead of myself a little bit. The first thing to note is that the DM status obviously adds +4 to your rally attempt. Basically what this tries to do is it makes it really hard for a unit to break and then get back into the action really quickly. Again, turns are only supposed to be a set amount of time within the quote-unquote game. So it wouldn't make sense that, an entire squad breaks and then 20 seconds later they're back, in fighting condition. This doesn't mean that it's impossible for this to occur, but it is, something to be mindful of. Another thing to remember or to take note of is that a leader is allowed to rally as many units that are stacked with him. So when you're performing rallies, you want to make sure to get the most, and this is why you want to protect your leaders as much as possible. Another thing is that there are certain benefits that you can gain based on what kind of hex you inhabit, which is why you want to make sure that units that route go to locations such as woods or building hexes, because those will give you a -1 to your rally attempt. Another thing to keep in mind is that a self-rally for a unit costs 1, as in it has a +1 modifier. So you have to be mindful of who you're going to attempt to rally, where, and why. All that said and done, you don't have to rally a unit. There's nothing in the rulebooks that forces you to rally units. However, unless you roll boxcars, aka 2 6s or a 12, there's no real reason not to attempt a rally. You can't activate a sniper on a rally roll, and worst comes to worst, you either get a 2 or a 12. In the case of a 12, you would have a casualty reduction of that unit. So if they're full squad, they go down to half. If they're half squad, they get eliminated. In addition, if you get a 2, you can get what's called a heat of battle event. We won't get into it too much because there's at least one example of that happening in my playthroughs, but it is an occurrence that can happen. So after rallies have all been attempted, you can also attempt to repair stuff. So in the case of the broken anti-tank rifle, I think that is, with the militia company A guy that just shot, you can repair on a 1, or you can break the gun on a 6. Anything between is a null result, so it doesn't matter what happens. It doesn't matter if it's 2, 3, 4, or 5. They will not do anything. I think there's a modifier to repairing weapons, but only if used, or only if that occurs with a captured weapon. But I could be wrong on that. I'm sure at some point I will have to look that up in my playthroughs, so it'll occur at some point. One of the most important things that I've been picking up with experience as I play, you really need to be able to one, form a plan. Obviously, it's really hard to determine exactly what the proper strategy you should go ahead with. For example, in a defending situation, I tend to spread my units out very much. But at times, it's not the best of choices. The other big factor is that you really want to know or understand what your win condition is. I don't think the guy I'm currently playing a scenario against will ever watch my videos, thankfully. Not that I have like any super big secrets or anything. But the biggest reason why I would hope he doesn't is because in our current game, he has an objective to capture a location, and he has to capture that location and have within its area of control a specific number of units. And as the current mission the scenario that we're going through right now, unfortunately, I don't believe he'll ever be able to ever reach that goal. And basically, he's a dead man walking at this point. And regardless of what he does, I don't think he'll be able to win. And for this mission, the entire goal of the Germans is to capture stone locations. So regardless if it's the dark stone like debris fields, we can see one at K6, I believe it's K6, as well as that'd be J5, I believe. Yeah. Those two are stone locations. As well, a stone location can be the second floor to a multi-story building. So the Germans need to capture, I believe it's 14 in the initial scenario. It might be 13, but regardless of the specific number, it means that as the Germans, you really want to be able to take advantage of any holes in the Russians' defense. And you want to be able to effectively breach those specific locations, but also to make sure you hold on to them. It's nice saying to yourself, well, I've got this amount of units, I have this much firepower, and my units can move this far. But if you have, say, 8 turns like I do to do these sorts of things with the Germans, you want to make sure you're getting the most out of every turn. And again, that's one of the harder parts about playing Advanced Squad Leader. When you're on attack, it's very hard, for me anyways, to determine when exactly I want to start shooting or when I want to start moving. And obviously you'll do a healthy mix of both, but being able to determine exactly when, with the various distances involved and costs of all the different hexes, you want to make sure that you're setting yourself up to capture locations with enough troops that you'll be able to hold them without too much difficulty. You don't want to leave too much up to chance, after all. Speaking of leaving things up to chance, I think I can safely say that my tank use with the Germans so far has been rather poor. Um, it's I don't have a great grasp on vehicles. Um, Defending against them is a little easier uh, because as long as you can figure out how you would turn, how you would position a gun, how you would turn it, and what specifically you want to shoot at, it's a good starter for compared to say what kind of ammo it has and even like what kind of ranges you're looking at, and covered arcs get kind of crazy. So I think the best way to go through it is the starter kit number 2, I believe, has guns that starts bringing in vehicles. If I remember, it starts bringing in vehicles, and it's one of those things where it's really handy to start getting to know just what the capabilities of vehicles, tanks, and just like trucks, cars, that sort of thing, versus guns and other support weapons. So yeah, my tank use has been, I think, poor. The fact that I lost the one of my first tanks to a critical hit is kind of just unlucky, and reflects the chaotic nature of ASL, just like that box cars I just rolled for that unit. But it's hard to determine exactly how you, again, for me, how to truly use my tanks, because it becomes a question of, if I get my tanks too close, there's such a thing called street fighting. Not to mention just we've seen close combat before, and close combat between units seems fairly straightforward when it comes to dice roll modifiers and who ambushes what. There's the same sort of system applied to units, infantry units that want to take out vehicles. We should see that eventually at some point, but it's its own set of issues with regards to how many people do you want to commit. When you advance into close combat versus vehicles, you also have to go through several, at least one check. And then it's a bunch of other additional modifiers going on. Another thing for me that's I wouldn't say super tough. Also, I messed up on a setup because I put a mortar without a unit, and I'm not sure if I was supposed to have a unit there or not. So I think I just leave it there. I just assume that I messed up. I'm not quite sure how I got to that point, but anyways, so I have a mortar that's just going to sit out and not do anything. Part of the errors, technically I could have probably just given it to a unit and just said, like, look, it makes no sense to have the rifle company guy next to him not have the mortar, but anyways. So the big issue when it comes to defending is you want to make sure that you're getting value out of everything you give up. One of the biggest bonuses that a defender can have is having units be concealed. We've already seen the bonus that is attributed to concealed units with regards to off-board artillery. So if an observer can't spot infantry, or its targets, really, then you have to get an extra chit draw, and it just makes it I don't want to say the system more complicated, but it does make it harder for whoever's trying to call in off-board artillery. On the flip side, or on a similar note, a concealed unit halves anything that basically comes towards them. And we're also seeing that I'm getting some really bad rolls. Thankfully, I only had everything breaks right there except one squad. Really bad luck on my part. Thankfully, the second squad I didn't realize had line of sight blocks. I kind of figured, but anyways, it clipped it, so couldn't do that. A couple things to point out. On the reverse side of at least two of those units, we saw a morale that was encased in a square. That basically means that that unit has a self-rally capability. And that self-rally capability, again, does not count towards your one or two attempts that you can do per turn on your own turn. Another thing to note is that when a leader breaks, if it's the first time they break, and trust me, this is a rule you'll always forget because it's really hard to determine or to remember, when a leader broke with large groups like this. In a smaller scenario, you should try to remember it just as a healthy thing to keep that sort of level of play that the developers desire to have, but also to make sure that you're punishing your opponent for the same sorts of mistakes. So basically, if a leader breaks for the first time, any unit that is stacked with them, or that is in that same location, goes through a task check. Meaning, they all take a task check, and if they fail that task check, they get pinned. This might not seem like anything that's super important, whether it's on attack or defense, but pinning down a unit can be really detrimental for your opponent. First and foremost, a unit that's pinned can't move, they can't advance, and they shoot at half firepower. Obviously, when your opponent is on defense and they can't move that turn, cutting out their movement altogether isn't as big as you might think, because they can't. However, having an opponent's firepower means that they're that less lethal to anything you may choose to do, whether it's your moves, whether it's dropping concealment, whether it's doing any number of quote-unquote crazy things. Getting back to concealment, since it seems important enough, again, it's a very important thing to determine, to know when to determine whether or not you should drop concealment. The biggest reason for that is that, again, concealment halves all firepower against it. So if you keep that up, if you don't ever decide to drop concealment, your opponent has to get a pin task check or better against you in order to even reveal or take off concealment. The idea being that you can't see your opponent, so you don't know specifically how many units are in there or what you should be shooting at specifically. So the idea becomes that with concealment, you're having all firepower against you. So if you can only attain a 36 firepower as the maximum number, 36 is very strong. Even on like a 15, I think you're still getting like a normal morale check. However, when you're having that down to 18, which doesn't exist, and that goes down to 16, it becomes a massive reduction in how much your opponent can do to you. Which is why, again, a concealed unit is very strong. Another thing that's beneficial, however, is probably never going to really come up in this playthrough, because I'm playing all of the units. By mousing over a unit, I know it's there. If you're playing against your opponent, everything underneath a question mark counter is invisible to you. You have no idea if that unit is fake, as you can get dummy counters that have nothing to them, or you could have units that may be very strong, but you can never really take that risk, and it forces your opponent to waste resources on them. Another thing too is that even if they suspect that there might be something there, depending on your opponent, they may be more or less willing to risk stuff against such said concealed units. And you really have to go the extra mile as an attacker in order to force reveals from an opponent. One of the easier ways to accomplish this, of course, is to deploy your squads. So if you have multiple squads, or half squads, I should say, you can at least send a half squad out, try to draw fire, have them, get right next to a concealed unit, and then, hope that there's some sort of interaction between the two. If that doesn't work, which is possible, if that doesn't work, then the attacking player now has to dedicate that much more men and material in order to reveal said units. It plays a little hand in hand with what's called opportunity fire, which frankly is something I rarely ever see anybody use. The idea with opportunity fire is that you can declare which units will shoot in the advanced fire phase, but that won't shoot right away. So it's something you declare in the preparatory fire phase, PFPH. You have to declare that. Oh, and I make a huge error here, so we'll get to that real quick. So in the PFPH, you have to declare whether or not you will do a opportunity fire. So you declare those, and you basically put a counter on them to mark them as such. I believe they drop concealment. I can't recall quite correctly at the moment. But regardless, at the advanced fire phase, they do not have their firepower. They stay at full firepower. Obviously, you must have a prep fire and an advancing fire in order to actually use opportunity fire. But it really allows a attacker to set up a line that they wish to attack with. A fire group here, a good couple of units there with some support weapons, etc. And you use your meat shield guys, your bait, to go out, draw fire, and then once you know what positions are occupied and what the strengths are and weaknesses are of any opponent's line, then you use opportunity fire to go in, wreck whatever they have, and then advance with whatever units that have already moved up, provided they aren't broken or dead or whatever the case may be. Here is getting to the actual video and contents of it. The artillery request, I made a huge mistake with it. So when it comes to artillery requests, there's a very complicated chart. The chart you can find in chapter C. You can find it near the end of it, but for those curious, offboard artillery is the first segment of chapter C. So C1, etc. Now, when you're performing offboard artillery requests, you have to make sure you have contact. Thankfully, the what we've been provided with as the Germans, you have access to radio and like your automatic offboard contact. So you never have to roll for that, which can be annoying. On top of that, you have to have line of sight to your target. If you do have line of sight to the building you want or the hex you want to target, but everything is invisible to you, aka concealed, you have to draw an extra chit to confirm the request. Now, unfortunately for me, I didn't realize that an extra chit is not permanently removed from the deck, so it does not stay to the left of the OBA screen. And because it's an extra chit draw, you draw it, you figure out what it gives you, and then you put it back in the deck. And you're supposed to shuffle the deck. So because I did that wrong, I'm putting both. I'm not counting the second red card because I shouldn't have gotten a second red card, because I should have shuffled the red card back into the deck. Alright, now that explanation is done, the reason why this is very important is because when you're getting off-board artillery, any red card stops whatever you're trying to do. Whether it's an extra chit draw or just a normal chit draw, a red card will kill that request. The more important thing to remember is that when you are placing a request, and let's say you've already gotten a red chit drawn, permanently removed from the deck, so not an extra chit draw, but when you draw a second red chit from your deck, you no longer have access to your artillery battery. It's determined by the fates that asset is required elsewhere, which means that it would be really tough in order to ever play with that sort of limitation. If extra chit draws counted, you be certain to lose your off-board artillery very quickly, as opposed to other things, because you're effectively taking out that many more chits that much more quickly. And we'll see that you can have artillery last a really long time. So again, I'm going through the different steps. So for those of you playing at home, you want to establish or maintain radio contact. Then you determine if there's a specific counter on the map, specifically your spotting round, or fire for effect 2, which wasn't the case. So we go to a chit draw, which is black. Then, once you have determined that you have access to your battery, you check to see if you have a fire for effect counter on the map. If you do not, you place an artillery request counter or a spotting round counter. More often, well, actually not more often than not, but if it's your first time placing a request, you place the artillery request on the hex that you want. Then again, you check to make sure that you have a line of sight on that location, and you roll. Well, if you don't have sight of any actual units, then you do the extra chit draw, which is what I messed up. If you happen to get black again, which you would reshuffle back into the deck, if you get black again, you now put the counter into that hex, and you check to see if that hex is a pre-registered hex or not. Generally speaking, a pre-registered hex would make it cost more in your purchase screen, but we'll see that way far from now. It's given to you in this initial scenario. Once you've determined if it's a pre-registered hex or not, you then roll to see if that is accurate. If it is accurate, you can go straight to your fire for effect. If it isn't, you put in a spotting round. Or you do an extent of deviation. You do an extent of error. If you don't have a pre-registered hex, you put a spotting round, and then you make an accuracy dice roll. And the reason for this is, of course, because you want to make sure that your artillery is actually going to shoot where you want your artillery to go. Now, the biggest difference between why a pre-registered hex is much better, a pre-registered hex is much better than just a standard spotting round artillery request, is that a pre-registered hex can resolve immediately, versus a spotting round, which you have to see if it's accurate or not. Your artillery unit basically has to shoot some pieces, some ammunition, to make sure that they're even hitting the right target, the right map coordinates. In this instance, again, I've got a pre-registered hex, so we don't have to worry about it. We'll just go straight to the fire for effect. Now, once you've determined that you do have a fire for effect, again, you resolve it, and you then go determine it's how much firepower it is bringing to quote-unquote the table. The accuracy dice roll changes. It's varied based on what nation you're playing. So for the Germans, your accuracy roll would normally be a 2. If it's on a pre-registered hex, it's a 4. And you're only rolling 1 dice, so much easier to roll on a pre-registered hex than not. Once you've actually gone through everything, you're resolving your your artillery. Again, you determine what the firepower is. In this case, we're shooting an 80 millimeter battalion mortar support group. So we're rolling at the 16 firepower. 16 firepower is actually pretty okay, but you do factor in terrain effect modifiers, or TEMs, to all of your attacks. So it can be useful, and generally speaking, the higher or better your artillery is, the more you'll want to use that on, say, stone structures and so on. Another thing that's not used by me in this specific day is that your mortars and so on can actually use different types of fire missions. So first and foremost is it's just straight up a regular high explosive attack. Another thing you can do is a smoke mission. So if you choose to, you could decide to just drop smoke on an entire hex row or in a giant cluster, depending on what kind of fire mission it is. Obviously, having smoke or white phosphorus, that sort of thing, drop in a certain location can be very useful because it blankets all of that vision, especially units trying to shoot out of a smoked area. It's very tough for them. And you then make it just that much easier for all your units to be able to advance up and try to get into whatever locations you've just smoked. Now, unfortunately for me, I don't make a smart play like that and use that to my advantage. Again, I'm getting some pretty bad rolls. 112, 10, 7's not really all that great. 6 isn't all that great. Some 5s and so on. Again, you have to take into account the terrain you're shooting into. So even on a 6, you're adding 3 for the stone building. So it just goes horribly wrong. As you might expect, another thing that off-board artillery can do, depending on what your rolls are, on a 12 you would dud, and a dud, I don't know why it's specifically even mentioned, I guess just for completeness sake, but a dud, which you can find in, actually, you know what, that might only be for, it might be for everything. Effectively, a 12 just makes it so that the attack doesn't do anything. So even if you, say, for example, had like a 36 firepower or something, but still rolled 12, natural 12, you wouldn't get anything out of it. You'd still just get a big old goose egg. On the flip side, you can imagine that a 2, or snake eyes, would give you a critical hit. And critical hits, they're different when it comes to terrain, and we'll see that at some point, I'm sure. It's also important to note that the 2-hit table that we're looking at right now, you really want to pay close attention to what those numbers and what the different weapons mean. When we're talking about a, say, gun and ammo basic 2-hit number modification, and we see a starred weapon, the -1 for a 13 to 18 hex range, what that means is the number that you must attain is lessened by 1. It's not that your dice roll that you're applying is down by 1. It is literally the number you must achieve. So if, for example, a vehicle is shooting at a 13 to 18 hex range, they need to get an 8. If they happen to have a short weapon, designated by the star, that decreases the number to 7. Now, you can imagine that when you factor in so many other things, like that vehicle's bundled up, which adds a 1, you have to add a terrain effect modifier to what you're shooting at, so the gun that's there gets a +3 for the stone debris, or the stone rubble. which is a stone location. That's another +3. So you're already looking at a minimum of 3. It's really hard to come up with that sort of number at will. Every time I get it, it's always random. Another thing to keep in mind is that the vehicle that I'm shooting with has a rate of fire, like many other weapons on the battlefield. And when you're rolling your 2 hits, and I guess I should specify, for any sort of weapon that has a encased squared number on their profile, when it comes to, say, like the heavy machine gun, we see a 3, I believe. The mortar has a 3, and I believe the tank has a 1. So if your colored die matches that rate of fire, you then get to you effectively get to shoot again for free. There's no added cost to it. There's no anything. It just means that you don't put a counter on it, and to mark it as having fired, and you can follow up with a second shot if you choose. And then obviously you go with whatever other modifier is, etc. modify that. Another thing to keep in mind is that tanks, because they have multiple guns, you can make multiple separate shots. So for example, I made a 2-hit attempt against the anti-tank gun, which missed. I rolled a 7. I would have needed, I think a 3 on that shot if I ever wanted to get anywhere. Additionally, I have 2 machine guns on the tank. One is at 3 firepower, I believe, in the hull, and one with 5 firepower mounted coaxially with the main gun. And because of the way that my tank is positioned and the turret is positioned, I can use those 2 in combination and shoot at a separate target. Now, it probably would have been a really smart idea to shoot the half squad there with a mortar rather than everything in the very well defended building, but alas, this is way back in the past and I didn't think about it back then. The biggest thing you really want to keep in mind is that those weapons all count separately, and you can technically make 3 separate attacks with them. So for example, with the tank I'm now trying to shoot with, over in D3, I could make a shot with its main gun versus the units occupying the building in F5. I could then take that same tank and shoot with its 3 firepower machine gun in the hull at, for example, the unit that prep fired in D8. I can also then make a third shot with my 5 firepower machine gun at any unit that the hull can target, which could include the unit with the mortar in, H5. Keep in mind too that there are also ways in order for you to turn your tank in order to make those shots. Obviously, you're incurring an additional modifier to any of your shots, but they can be done. So, for example, I could have had my tank turn its turret and say shoot at the units over in L5. There'd be a +2 modifier to that sort of attack, and so on, but it can still be done. And because I rolled boxcars while I was shooting my bow machine gun, I believe that it should be my bow machine gun rather than coaxial. Because I rolled that. Oh no, wait, I remember. Okay, so I used both machine guns at the same time in a fire group, and when you do that sort of thing and break a weapon, you then have to roll random selection to determine which one of those weapons breaks. Because it wouldn't be fair, quote unquote, if you just had something bad happen, but let's say you're in a doom stack, as some people call them, where you have 4 machine guns in the same stack and they're all shooting. It wouldn't make sense that they all break at the same time. That being said, it is possible via random selection to have all of those guns break if they all roll the same number. But expecting that you'll roll 4 6s in a row is kind of, you know, you should be buying lotto tickets at that point. I'm never quite sure if this is the strong move to make or not. But typically, I will follow up shots on broken units to see if I can get an extra result on them. The biggest reason for that is because there are two types of ways to knock out a unit. I don't want to say permanently from a mission, but to basically render them ineffective for quite a bit of time. A bit of time. The first way is just by breaking them. When they have desperation morale, you can almost guarantee that they won't rally in their next attempt, which could be as soon as your next player turn or the next game turn, depending on which comes first. Or I guess I should just say like opponent's turn, whichever comes first. So, because it could happen in that regard, it's also, because it's unlikely, you're basically dooming that unit to remain broken for more than one turn. And if you can't get a leader to get to them, they will then subsequently stay broken for quite some time. If you can reapply a desperation morale status to that broken unit on a turn other than the first one it broke and no longer had a DM, again, you're basically just adding on problems for your opponent. And some people choose to simply... Oh man, that would have been a really good roll too. And some people, like myself, I like to reshoot at broken units because they're more susceptible to breaking again. Generally speaking, a broken unit will have its morale reduced. So if you can defeat it once, you can then hope to get a similar result a second time. They'll be worse at their morale check, and if they miss a morale check while already broken, they get casualty reduced. Again, which is really good. Unlikely kill probably won't come into play for a long time. I think I've already mentioned cowering with doubles. I rolled the IFT for the units over in, what was that, G1 in the building, because they didn't have a shot, and you have to roll these sorts of things, because even though it was a really good 3 and I didn't do anything, if it was an allied sniper activation, I would have rolled for the allied sniper. At the same time, if I rolled boxcars, I then have to break that gun. So, useful to keep in mind when you're doing that sort of thing. For the good example would have been the tank earlier, where I broke one of the machine guns on it. So here, instead of having 10 firepower down to 8, I only have 4. Which won't get me anything. If I was shooting at that unit with a 8 firepower, I would have had an 8 on 8, which I believe gives me a normal morale check. So that should give you a clear idea as to just how strong or valuable it is to keep that sort of thing active. I believe I was checking there to see line of sight, and it wasn't going to do anything. I messed up here because at the rally phase I should have transferred the ownership of the machine gun. I should have put it on a unit that could actually shoot at stuff. Instead, I did not do so, and yeah, I think my attack is going to suffer a little bit on this side for it. So this is a, what, 2? This has been a 7 on 2? Yeah, not going to get me much. Here's also a very constant reminder about how you should really pay attention to some of the special rules. I didn't realize that all these debris locations up north are count at half height, which is what they are. And I did read about how they block line of sight to a same level hex. So again, units in say L2 can't see units in N3, despite being relatively close to each other. But the biggest screw up was that I didn't realize they didn't create blind hexes. So you can see somebody at level 2 can see anywhere there. There shouldn't be an issue. So again, because I didn't realize that, I'm spending a number of moments really wishing that I had properly understood that on both sides, because it would have been really important. So I get a really good hit from this mortar. That's a 4. I don't believe that touched the smoke hex, so there's no modifier there. Area fire doesn't take into account terrain effect modifiers. That's on the IFT table. And a mortar has a very special property in that when using area fire, which mortars must use, you don't have a choice in that, because mortars are inherently inaccurate weapons and used for suppression rather than pinpoint targeting. Not to say that they can't be used for that, but in general, you're trying to suppress guys. You're trying to fire a mortar into an area rather than on a specific target. Especially the smaller it goes, the smaller the target is, the harder it is to hit, and so on. Regardless, a mortar, when using area target type, must reduce its firepower by half. It doesn't go to the next lowest or anything. It is halved based on that weapon size or whatever. So if a 50mm mortar would normally give you 8 firepower, it goes down to 4. Generally speaking, this is modified by 2 factors. The first is that mortars are allowed to use acquisition. So acquisition basically gives you a minus dice roll modifier, or DRM. I'll be using DRM a lot, guys. So if I happen to start using acronyms instead, apologies. If you don't know what I mean, just let me know, and I'll restate it. But the negative DRM that is applied just makes it that much better. And unlike, say, a target acquisition on a specific unit, the mortar here would just need to have line of sight on the area, that hex that it's attacking. When you have a target acquisition on a specific unit, if that unit ever breaks line of sight with the targeting unit, they'd have to drop that acquisition. Basically what it means is that subsequent shots will always be better, because the men in the tank or the men behind the mortar can see what they're shooting at, and therefore can adjust. They can say, range is 400 meters instead of 300 meters, or etc., and adjust accordingly. So here I'm just checking the rules again, just to make sure I fully understand that, yes, mortars is half firepower, and I'm not sure why I'm 100% dilly-dallying on this. This is kind of the plus to having a digital rule book at my hands, so I can just quickly search these things without having to waste too much time. And while it might seem boring, I do think that these parts should really be in the final videos, because these things are important that you shouldn't feel bad for having to check the rulebook, especially with Advanced Squad Leader. Obviously, if you've been playing the game for 12 years, you should probably have a basic grasp on what the infantry fire table is, and like what your numbers and modifiers should stand for. But again, with a game this crazy, to say something like, "Oh, do you have a shock or unconfirmed kill on your vehicle?" Sure, it might not be something that's come up in the last like 20 games you've played, which you only do every like, you only play one game a month if you're lucky. So, again, don't worry too much about having to check the rules. At worst, you learn something, and honestly, if that's the worst, then you're doing pretty well. Now, the more important thing here that I will hopefully realize. Oh man, let's have to 2. So that's not super strong, but still could be worse. Yeah, all units hit by a high explosive are attacked on the IFT using a single dice roll and half the firepower of the firing ordnance. So again, whenever you're performing area target type, you got to realize that you're at half the firepower of the firing ordnance. So this should be. I might calculate it wrong and think, oh, it's a 25 millimeter rather than 50, but it should be at the 2 firepower because 6 divided by 2. Anyways. I don't know why I rolled the other. I think that was just a mistake. Sometimes I try to keep the rolls to their respective things because otherwise it gets too hard to come back to after the fact. So yeah, I think I screwed the Russian side over with. I could have gotten a good 3 instead of a 7. But again, because I rolled a 2 on the 2 hit, I should actually get. Oh, right. Should have a rate of fire, but I don't think you have rate of fire in advanced fire phase. So I should have used that at the prep fire stage, because otherwise I would have had a 2 hit. Because I rolled the 2, it would have been a rate of fire, which means after I'd resolved the first shot, say if it was the 7, I'd be able to get a second shot in, and if that was a 3 or lower on the colored die, I could get a third shot, and a fourth shot, and a fifth shot, and a seventh, and so on. Obviously, that relies on a lot of luck in order to get through, but I mean, suffice to say, it's very powerful if you can manage to get a heavy machine gun or something and constantly get to shoot with it, because you can do a lot of damage that way. You just have to make sure you don't get boxcars at some point. There was an example of interception right there. So I had to move that unit because if I didn't, they would just be eliminated outright. Low crawling into D5 was an option. Actually, you know what? 1, 2. No, okay, yeah. So low crawling into D5 would have been acceptable because I'm not going closer. Actually, you know what? I think that would have been a failure, an elimination anyways, because I would be going closer towards the tank. I would be closing the distance by 1 hex. So, and that was in line of sight. So I should have eliminated that guy. But of course, I'm way too far behind in that respect to be able to do it. So, but just goes to show, like, even routing can be a little complicated, and you kind of need to pay attention to all the different things going on. But the interdiction was because I didn't want to low crawl because it seemed like a really bad idea to have my unit just out in the middle of a street during a German turn. So get them out of the way, try to run to a friendly leader, and have that leader be able to do something, like help them rally in more than one turn. And I say more than one turn specifically because when it comes to really bad quality units, such as like the conscript level Russians, when you have a broken morale side of like 4 or 5, a desperation morale basically eliminates any ability to rally that. Unless you can get a 2 reliably, you're kind of just screwed. Also, I think I just realized that I might have been shooting from the non-usable mortar. I'm also not quite sure why I moved a mortar back. There is no unit attached with it, so I don't know what's going on there. So now we have the close combat phase. There's only one possible thing going on, and it's important to realize that it might seem really stupid to have a 4-2-6 go into close combat versus 2-5-4-8s, but the reason why I'm trying to do this is because they are pinned. Now, pinned has firepower, yes, and that is more important, or mostly important, in any sort of fire phase, but it does apply to anybody who is currently in a close combat. So we can see the second in the second row on the left column, we can see by CCDRM, by guarding, motion, or pinned unit, basically it halves their firepower. So those guys combined would only make 5 versus my 4. Now I still don't want to take a disadvantage result because I'm not, I don't want that. So instead, I will have my 4-2-6 target one of the 5-4-8s. At the same time, I want those 2 5-4-8s to work as a team to take out that one guy rather than have 2 separate roles. Because if I had each of those squads act independently, I'd be rolling on the 1-to-2 ratio twice, which means I would have to roll a 4 in one of those 2 rolls to hope to get a result. And I can tell you that's not really good. I don't believe I have any other modifiers here. I think I'm just checking the rulebook to make sure I fully understand the pin stuff. And obviously I'm after the fact in post recording for audio, I can sound really smart when I'm jumping to these things really quickly when I'm going through the rulebook, just to make sure that again I'm understanding everything properly. It's been a little bit since I last played, or at least like a big game. I know I play a scenario every so often with a buddy, but you don't come across all the same scenarios all the time. Like ours just has not had close combat yet, so you get a little rusty at some spots. And I'll also claim a little bit of nervousness in having to actually play this for an online audience, mainly because you see a thing like this in regular play, it's like, oh, it's not a big deal, like maybe nerves or whatever. And when you're doing it online, it's like I don't want to get pooped on by people. Now, technically, I probably should have been rolling on the 3-2 for the 4-2-6, and because they're attacking, I'm rolling for them first. So the Russians rolled a 9. That is nowhere near good enough to get any sort of positive result. The Germans roll a 5, which is exactly what they need on a 1-to-1. So sadly for the Russians, they lose another guy. I deleted it, which I don't know why, because I won't be able to track that now. Um, and that's actually really important. You don't want to go deleting counters, unless like they turn into prisoners or whatever. But you probably shouldn't do that anyways. I'm also checking to see if I have to roll for a support weapon destruction. Because, there we go. Because when you kill a unit, you have to see if you destroy the weapon that they're carrying. Because otherwise, I could pick up that anti-tank rifle and use it against its previous owners. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you for the next turn.